All right, the Compromise of 1850. This is going to, as I alluded to in the last bit of lecture, not resolve the conflict over slavery and its expansion, but delay it until 1860. Okay, so it's not going to resolve the new conflict between North and South, between anti-slavery and pro-slavery factions, but it will delay the it will delay the final conflict. Okay, 10 years. Now, the compromise is proposed by Henry Clay. Henry Clay, the founder of the Whig Party, right? The guy who wanted to promote this American system of an integrated capitalist economy, improve the infrastructure with roads and canals and railroads, and who, wanted to promote a kind of common American identity between North and South. He has come to really not, kind of despise slavery, but again, he wants to unite the different the white people in the South and North, and he doesn't want civil war. So he doesn't call for. He's not an abolitionist. In other words, he wants a gradual decline of slavery. But Henry Clay is going to be the guy that proposes the compromise. Okay, was one of the most famous statesmen of the era, along with Calhoun and along with Daniel Webster, who was another Whig. Right, we've mentioned I think all three of these guys before. So Daniel Webster and Henry Clay are going to be pushing for compromise. Like, let's find a solution. Let's have the North make some concessions. Let's have the South make some concessions. Let's find a solution. Calhoun is going to be the biggest advocate, saying, look, no, we're not compromising. We're not going to, we need what the federal government needs to do, Calhoun is going to say, is protect the property rights of Southerners, their right to own slaves, okay? But these three men are going to be battling it out, and also one of their opponents is going to be William Seward, a senator from New York, who's going to be making the moral argument against slavery. So you have all these different, positions emerging, right? Those who are kind of moderate, who want to continue this policy of find a compromise. Tolerate evil a little bit longer. Those, the evil of slavery a little bit longer. Those who are now claiming, right, that the federal government needs to protect the slave owner right to oppress other people because property rights. And then those who are making the moral argument against slavery and the Constitution's responsibility to protect the natural rights of all people. Okay, all men are created equal. So these kind of three different ideological these three different positions on slavery are facing off against each other in the debates over the Compromise of 1850, right? The radical slavery position, the moderate position of Clay, to delay and hope that slavery will die out, and the moral position of opposing slavery on a moral basis of Seward. These three positions are facing off against each other in 1850, all right? Now, the original resolutions that Clay proposed, there were 8 of them, okay? And he wanted to admit California as a free state, okay? And he wanted to admit the rest of the area of New Mexico as a territory without commenting on slavery at all, without restricting it, in other words. He wanted to also, there was a kind of dispute over the border of Texas, whether the border of Texas and New Mexico extended along the Rio Grande or whether it was further to the east of that. He wanted to resolve that in favor of New Mexico, but give Texas some compensation. He also wanted to abolish the slave trade, but guarantee slavery in the District of Columbia. And finally, he wanted the federal government to give up the right to regulate the interstate slave trade. And he wanted to strengthen Southerners' rights to go up into the North and take back their slaves who had escaped. Okay, so within this group of resolutions that he proposes, there are both, of course, concessions that would have to be made by the South. For instance, allowing California in as a free state. And concessions that would have to be made by the anti-slavery faction. For instance, right, the giving up, allowing Southerners to use the federal government to go and reclaim their slaves in the North. Okay, this is one of the things that I find very disingenuous about the argument that the Civil War was about states' rights, because Southerners, the radical slave-owning Southerners, only supported states' rights when it was beneficial to them protecting the institution of slavery. They want to use the federal government to protect their right to own slaves if they can. right? So in other words, they want the federal government to say Southerners can take slaves into any territory in the West. Southerners can take slaves up into the North. Southerners can go up into the North and reclaim slaves and recapture them and bring them south. Federal government should protect the Southerners' right to own other people. In other words, that's what the radical slave faction says. And so it's not a question of states' rights versus federal government. The question is really one of slavery, whether you're for it or you're against it. That is the central issue, and we see that very clearly in the Compromise of 1850 and in the debates over the Compromise. Okay, so you have Daniel Webster giving this famous speech calling for compromise in order to save the Union. You have John Calhoun getting up. He's like on his deathbed. He's wrapped up in this like flannel blanket. He can't pronounce this speech, but somebody's reading it for him as he's sitting there, like, you know, and it's like this dire warning that the South has to be an equal partner with the North. Otherwise, civil war will break out. You've got William Seward, the senator from New York, who makes a very famous speech called the Higher Law speech, in which he argues that the Constitution would allow for the abolition of slavery everywhere in the United States territory, because the Constitution is there to protect the rights of every person. And he's alluding to the Declaration of Independence, and he says, all men are created equal. And he says the Constitution really is alluding to the higher law of God and the responsibility that the United States government has to protect the rights of every man, woman, and child, regardless of race. So William Seward is making this higher law speech, which is a very famous speech, which is condemned by all the other people. Henry Clay says it's too much, it's too radical. Even Taylor doesn't like it, right? So, but he's still making the speech. It's a great speech, the higher law. It's a good speech. The parts of it I know. The higher law speech, great speech. All right, and then you have an exacerbation of the whole thing when in New Mexico there's a little group of people that come together and say they're going to declare themselves to be a free state, okay, and then that causes the governor, I think it's the governor of Texas, to threaten to invade New Mexico and reclaim territory. So there's essentially what's about to happen is Texas troops and federal troops are about to face off in New Mexico, okay? The South is on the verge of secession. There's literally like no consensus within the Congress about what to do about the compromise. And, Zachary Taylor as the president is holding firm to his commitment to bring in the Western territories as free territories, and then all of a sudden, and he drops dead. Taylor just drops dead. He's like listening to this group, to these speeches all day long. He's got like federal troops ready to go into Texas, or ready to defend the border of New Mexico against Texas invasion if necessary. He's like ready to, and he's listening to all these speeches. It's a long hot day. He goes home and eats like too many cherries, and he gets like a stomach, I don't know, some kind of stomach, something happens, and he just drops dead overnight. Shocking. Okay, and his vice president comes in, Millard Fillmore, who is a northerner but who favors the South. Okay, so you had Taylor, who was a southerner favoring the North and the anti-slavery free soilers in the West, at least, and you have Millard Fillmore, who comes in, who's a northerner supporting the kind of the slave faction. Okay, all right. Essentially, they try to pass the Compromise of 1850, the resolutions of Henry Clay, as all together in an omnibus bill, meaning it's all tied up together. Fails, right? Because there's all these different groups who can't agree with each other, right? And Clay then, Henry Clay is kind of older. He's at his 70s. He's had a long career. He's tired. He retreats. He goes back to Kentucky to take a rest. And Stephen Douglas comes in and is the guy who is responsible for pushing through the Compromise of 1850. Stephen Douglas, he's most famous for the debates he will have with Abraham Lincoln when they face off against each other later in the election of 1860. But Stephen Douglas is this hard-drinking, pragmatic, short man, but he is a sort of fierce negotiator. And what he does is he takes the Missouri Compromise, he breaks it up into a bunch of different bills, like 8 different bills, and he's going to push through each one independently. And he builds a different majority, a different coalition majority for each piece of legislation in order to push the different elements of the Missouri Compromise through independently of each other. Okay. So essentially what happens, you have both some concessions being made by the northern anti-slavery movement, some concessions being made by the southern pro-slavery people, but California comes in as a free state. The slave trade is prohibited in D.C., and the border dispute between New Mexico and Texas is settled in favor of New Mexico with $10 million of compensation going to Texas. So those are the pro-North elements of the Missouri Compromise. And then the pro-South elements are stronger fugitive slave laws, meaning Southerners are going to be able to go up into the North and recapture their escaped slaves. And the northern states will not be allowed, or it will be harder for them to protect those escaped slaves. There will be also no restrictions on slavery made in New Mexico and in Utah. So what they decide to do is they decide to break up the New Mexico territory into two sections, Utah in the northern section of it and New Mexico in the southern section of it, and to say in both of those areas there will be no restrictions made on slavery. Okay, so you have I guess the majority of people happy that a compromise is reached. Civil war is averted. In the short term, it's delayed essentially up until 1860. Not that it's inevitable, but Douglas is able to prevent civil war from breaking out. Of course, you have people who are unhappy. The abolitionists are very unhappy with certain elements, the strengthening of the fugitive slave laws that make it easier for slaves to be recaptured, for instance. You have Southern slave owners like Calhoun who are upset because they don't want any restrictions on slavery in the West. Okay. But the crisis is delayed at least, all right? Now, the longest lasting consequence of it is going to be the strengthening of those fugitive slave laws. And that was actually the element that was debated the least, but it's going to be the most important cause of intensification of conflict going into the 1850s. And we'll start dealing with the fugitive slave laws next week. All right.